The year is 1206. On the banks of the Onon River, in what is now Mongolia, a council of tribal chiefs gathered. They proclaimed a man named Temujin as Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. He was approximately 44 years old. He controlled a territory roughly the size of modern Mongolia, about 1.5 million square kilometers. 21 years later, when Genghis Khan died in 1227, the Mongol Empire stretched from Korea to the Caspian Sea, 24 million square kilometers, the largest contiguous land empire in human history. Standard historical narrative presents this as military conquest. Mongol hordes sweeping across Asia and Europe, destroying cities, massacring populations, building pyramids of skulls. The image of Genghis Khan as a barbarian destroyer has dominated for 800 years. But this narrative misses the fundamental purpose of Mongol expansion. Genghis Khan was not building an empire for the sake of conquest. He was building infrastructure for the sake of trade, because nomads, unlike agricultural civilizations, cannot survive without trade. In the Silk Road, the network of trade routes connecting China to Europe was the most valuable economic asset in the medieval world. Genghis Khan did not just conquer the Silk Road, he rebuilt it, secured it, and created the first truly global economy. For 150 years under Mongol rule, goods and ideas flowed from Beijing to Venice with lower transaction costs and greater security than at any time before the 19th century. This is not the story you learned in school. This is the economic history of the Mongol Empire. To understand why Genghis Khan built a trade empire rather than a territorial empire, you need to understand the economics of nomadic societies. Nomads live by herding animals across grasslands. This produces meat, milk, leather, and wool, but it does not produce grain, metal, textiles, or manufactured goods. For those, nomads must trade. A nomadic economy is inherently dependent on external trade. Without access to agricultural and urban markets, nomadic societies cannot obtain the tools, weapons, and luxury goods necessary for survival and status competition. This creates a structural vulnerability. If trade routes are closed or if agricultural civilizations refuse to trade, nomads face economic collapse. China understood this. For centuries, Chinese dynasties used trade as a weapon against steppe nomads. When nomads were compliant, China opened border markets and allowed trade. When nomads raided or demanded too much, China closed the markets and imposed embargoes. This was economic warfare, and it was devastatingly effective. By the late 12th century, the Jin dynasty of northern China had implemented a trade embargo against Mongol tribes. Mongol leaders could not obtain iron for weapons, grain for food, or silk for status display. Genghis Khan's rise to power was partly driven by his promise to break this embargo. But he understood something more fundamental. Relying on any single trading partner was a structural weakness. The solution was not to beg China to reopen markets. The solution was to conquer and control the entire Silk Road so that no single civilization could strangle Mongol trade. This was the strategic logic behind Mongol expansion. Every conquest was oriented towards securing trade routes. The Silk Road was not a single road. It was a network of routes stretching approximately 6,000 kilometers from Chang'an in China to Constantinople in the Byzantine Empire. Along these routes, silk, spices, precious metals, gems, and manufactured goods moved between civilizations. But before the Mongols, the Silk Road was fragmented and dangerous. The route passed through dozens of different kingdoms, sultanates, and tribal territories. Each demanded tolls and tariffs. Merchants needed to negotiate with local rulers, hire armed escorts, and navigate complex political relationships. Banditry was endemic. Caravans were regularly attacked and plundered. The risk was so high that merchants often sold goods at each political boundary rather than traveling the entire route themselves. A bolt of Chinese silk might change hands 20 times before reaching Europe, with each intermediary taking a cut. Transaction costs were enormous. A product might increase in price by 1,000% or more as it moved from origin to final destination, not because of scarcity, but because of the cost of moving it through hostile and fragmented territory. This was economically inefficient, but no single political entity controlled enough territory to solve the problem, until Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan's military campaigns are well documented. What is less understood is that military conquest was the first phase of a two-phase strategy. Phase 1, conquer the territory. Phase 2, build infrastructure to make trade profitable. The infrastructure project began immediately after conquest and was, in many ways, more impressive than the military victories. The centerpiece was the YAM system. The YAM was a network of postal relay stations built every 25 to 30 kilometers along major trade and communication routes. Each station maintained fresh horses, food, and shelter. Official couriers carrying messages for the Mongol administration could travel from one station to the next, exchange their exhausted horses for fresh ones, and continue immediately. This created communication speed unprecedented in the medieval world. A message could travel from Beijing to the western edge of the empire, over 5,000 kilometers, in approximately 2 weeks. Before the Yam, such communication might take months or be impossible. But the Yam was not just for official messages. Merchants were allowed to use the system. A merchant caravan could stop at Yam stations for rest, food, and fresh animals. This dramatically reduced travel time and risk. At its peak, the Yam network included over 10,000 stations. It required approximately 200,000 horses maintained across the empire. The logistical complexity was staggering, but it worked. Under Mongol rule, a merchant could travel from Venice to Beijing in relative safety, with predictable stops, reliable food and shelter, and minimal interference from local authorities. The second critical infrastructure element was security enforcement. Genghis Khan implemented a policy of absolute intolerance for banditry and theft. The penalty for robbing a merchant was death, not just for the thief, but often for their entire family or clan. This was not symbolic. Mongol administrators enforced it ruthlessly. Entire villages were destroyed if they harbored bandits. Roads were patrolled by Mongol cavalry. Merchants traveling under Mongol protection carried a paiza, a tablet inscribed with Mongol authority, guaranteeing safe passage. The result was that the Silk Road under Mongol control became safer than many medieval cities. A merchant with a Mongol paiza could travel through territories that had been warring with each other and face less risk than walking through the streets of Paris at night. This safety collapsed transaction costs. Merchants no longer needed to hire large armed escorts. They no longer needed to pay protection money to local warlords. They could carry more goods and fewer weapons. Trade volume exploded. The third infrastructure element was standardization. Before the Mongols, every kingdom along the Silk Road used different weights, measures, and currencies. A merchant needed to constantly convert units and exchange money, losing value with each transaction. Genghis Khan imposed standardized weights and measures across the empire. A pound in Beijing was the same as a pound in Baghdad. This eliminated conversion costs and reduced opportunities for fraud. More radically, the Mongols implemented a paper currency system. Paper money had been invented in China during the Song dynasty, but it was not widely trusted outside China because it had no intrinsic value. It was just printed paper. The Mongol solution was simple and brutal. Accept our paper money or die. Kublai Khan, Genghis's grandson, issued a decree in 1260 declaring that Mongol paper currency was legal tender throughout the empire. Merchants were required to accept it in payment. Anyone caught refusing Mongol paper money faced execution. This was not a request. It was enforcement at sword point. But here is the critical detail. The Mongols backed this enforcement with credibility. They maintained silver reserves to redeem paper currency on demand. They punished counterfeiters with death. They ensured that the money supply was controlled to prevent inflation. The result was that Mongol paper currency became trusted across the empire. Merchants accepted it because they knew other merchants would accept it, and because refusing meant death, and because the Mongol government had demonstrated that it would maintain the currency's value. This was the first large-scale fiat currency system backed not by gold or silver, but by state violence and administrative competence. It worked. For over a century, paper money circulated across the Mongol Empire, facilitating trade on a scale not seen again until the modern era. The combination of the Yam system, security enforcement, standardization, and paper currency created what historians call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. Between approximately 1250 and 1350, the Silk Road functioned as a single integrated economic zone. A merchant in Venice could trade directly with a merchant in Beijing. Goods moved across the entire route with minimal friction. This had profound consequences. Technology transfer accelerated. Gunpowder, printing, and compass technology moved from China to Europe. Persian astronomy and mathematics flowed east. The exchange of ideas was as important as the exchange of goods. Cultural exchange increased. The most famous example is Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who traveled to China in the 1270s and served in Kublai Khan's court. Marco Polo's journey is often presented as a tale of adventure and discovery. But economically, it was only possible because of Mongol infrastructure. Polo traveled under Mongol protection with a paiza guaranteeing safe passage. He used Yam stations for rest and supplies. He paid with Mongol currency. Without the Mongol Empire, Polo's journey would have been suicidal. With Mongol infrastructure, it was merely long and uncomfortable. Polo was not unique. Thousands of merchants, missionaries, and diplomats traveled the Silk Road during the Pax Mongolica. The volume of trade and cultural exchange between East and West during this period was not matched again until the age of European maritime exploration in the 16th century. But the Pax Mongolica had a structural fragility. It depended entirely on Mongol military and administrative capacity to enforce the system. And in the 14th century, that capacity began to collapse. The decline began with internal succession conflicts. After Kublai Khan's death in 1294, the Mongol Empire fragmented into separate khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. These khanates began fighting each other, The unified trade zone fractured. Tariffs reappeared at borders. Security enforcement weakened. Then came the Black Death. The plague, likely originating in Central Asia, spread along the Silk Road trade routes. Between 1347 and 1353, it killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people, approximately 30 to 60% of Europe's population. Trade collapsed. Cities along the Silk Road were decimated. The yam system fell into disrepair as there were not enough people to maintain the stations. And finally, in 1368, the Ming dynasty overthrew Mongol rule in China and closed China's borders to foreign trade. The Silk Road, as an integrated economic system, ceased to function. Trade between East and West contracted dramatically. The routes became dangerous again. The infrastructure decayed. Europe, cut off from Asian trade, was forced to seek alternative routes. This ultimately led to the age of maritime exploration. Columbus, da Gama, Magellan, they were all trying to recreate the trade connections that had existed under Mongol rule by going around the now closed land routes. The Mongol Empire proved that globalization is not a natural state. It is a constructed system that requires enforcement. Trade does not flow freely. It flows through infrastructure that must be built and maintained. Security does not exist by default. It must be imposed through credible threat of violence against those who disrupt commerce. Standardization does not emerge spontaneously. It must be mandated and enforced. The Mongols understood this. They built the yam system. They executed bandits. They forced acceptance of paper currency. They created the conditions for trade to flourish, and when Mongol power declined, the entire system collapsed within decades. This is the lesson for the modern world. The current global trade system, what we call globalization, is similarly constructed and similarly fragile. It depends on infrastructure, like container ships and logistics networks. It depends on security enforcement through international treaties and naval dominance. It depends on standardization of currency systems and trade regulations. The Mongol yam stations every 25 miles are conceptually identical to Amazon distribution centers every 50 miles. Both are logistics infrastructure designed to reduce transaction costs. The Mongol paiza, guaranteeing safe passage, is conceptually identical to international shipping insurance and flag of convenience registrations. Both are mechanisms to reduce risk and encourage trade. Mongol paper currency enforced at sword point is conceptually identical to the Petrodollar system enforced through military presence in oil-producing regions. Both are fiat systems backed by state power rather than intrinsic value. The structure is the same, only the technology has changed. And just like the Mongol system, the modern system is fragile. The Pax Mongolica lasted approximately 100 years. The modern global trade system, built after World War II, is approximately 80 years old. Both depend on a hegemon maintaining the infrastructure and enforcing the rules. When the hegemon weakens, the system fractures. After 1368, when the Ming closed China's borders, trade did not gradually decline. It collapsed. European merchants who had established operations in Asia lost everything. Trade routes that had functioned for a century became impassable within a decade. The same pattern is visible today. As American hegemonic power weakens, the global trade system is showing stress. China is building alternative logistics networks through the Belt and Road Initiative. BRICS nations are creating alternative currency systems. Supply chain fragmentation is increasing. These are not random developments. They are the predictable response to declining confidence in the existing system's enforcer. Genghis Khan built an empire specifically to control trade infrastructure. He understood that military conquest was meaningless unless it was followed by economic integration. The Mongols conquered 24 million square kilometers, not for the sake of territory, but to secure 6,000 kilometers of trade routes. They built 10,000 postal stations, not for military communication, but to reduce merchant travel time. They enforced brutal penalties for banditry, not out of moral concern, but because trade requires security. They mandated paper currency, not as monetary policy experimentation, but because currency standardization reduces transaction costs. Every decision was oriented toward maximizing trade efficiency. And it worked. For a century, the Silk Road functioned better than it ever had before, or would again for 500 years. Then the system collapsed, and the dark ages of trade began. Europe and Asia were cut off from each other. Technology transfer stopped. Economic growth stagnated. It took European maritime exploration to recreate the connections that had existed under Mongol rule. And it took another 400 years, until the 19th century, to build land-based infrastructure that matched the efficiency of the Mongol yam system. Genghis Khan was not a barbarian destroyer. He was an infrastructure builder who understood that trade is the foundation of wealth and power. And that lesson, repeatedly forgotten and painfully relearned, remains as relevant today as it was in 1206. Control the infrastructure. Enforce the security. Standardize the systems. That is how you build an empire. That is how you control an economy. 24 million square kilometers. Not for land, for logistics.